Want to hear something crazy? Here we are 10 years out from the financial crisis, and we have no idea what caused it. Yeah, there's a lot of people going around saying they know what caused it, and writing books and giving lectures and whatnot, but they don't know. And the reason nobody really knows what caused the financial crisis is that no one asked Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, or Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, exactly why they were lying about why those banks supposedly needed a bailout. You know, what exactly were you guys covering up? What were you hiding? And no one ever asked them that question. So to this day, we don't have any certain knowledge about what caused the financial crisis because Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson were lying about why the banks needed a bailout. The whole thing is crazy. If you go into any police interrogation room in this country and you tell even the tiniest lie, you know exactly what's going to happen. There's going to be a cop in that room and he's going to chase down the details of that lie. Because the cop knows that behind the lie there is very likely sitting a crime. And that is exactly why you see, after financial crises, cops show up. After the Great Depression in the late 20s and early 30s, it was Ferdinand Pecora and the Pecora Commission. After the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s and early 90s, it was Edwin Gray and Bill Black. After every crisis, the cops show up and they start asking questions. Until 2008. And that is where things got inverted. That is where the world got turned on its head. We did not get cops after the 2008 financial crisis. We got clowns. And we did not get any real investigations after the 2008 financial crisis. We got circuses. Gee, I wonder why. Welcome to Mafiacracy Now, here on Best Evidence. My name is John Titus, for those of you who don't know me, and today we are going to look at the top three. No, not the top three automakers, the top three bailout lies, as told to us by Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson. What's interesting about these lies is that they all have the same hook. Remember, these guys wanted to get cash to Wall Street, so they had to convince the American public that Wall Street and Main Street were tied together at the hip. And they came up with three different lies. And the reason they needed three different editions of the same lie is that they would tell one, people wouldn't believe it, and then they would move on to the other one. And the hook in all three lies was the same. It was that if Wall Street goes down, Main Street's going with it. If Goldman Sachs goes down, then that RV plant in Shipshewana, Indiana is going right down with it. That was the hook. It's a classic Chicken Little story, and it was totally false. What is interesting about this is that Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson reiterated all three of these lies in a secret closed-door session with Congress on Thursday, September 18th, 2008. And we know this from congressional record and congressional testimony. But it's very clear that they told all three lies. So let's get right into these lies. The first lie comes courtesy of Ben Bernanke, and it is the commercial paper lie. We've got it right here. Take a look at this clip.
Tell us, and again, Senator Schumer mentioned the other evening when we sat on Thursday night, the reason why we have to act, and put aside whether or not we're going to act this week or next week. But for a minute, tell us why you believe it's critically important, one, that we act. What are the circumstances out there that warrant us responding as quickly as we're being asked to? And secondly, do you believe that the amount being asked for is going to adequately address the issue, particularly if we adopt the plan as suggested by the Secretary?
Mr. Chairman, the financial markets are in quite fragile condition.
Okay, sorry to interrupt that. I just need to point out this guy here on the left. This is Scott Alvarez. Scott Alvarez at that time was the general counsel of the Federal Reserve. He was the Fed's top lawyer. Remember him and maybe keep your eye on him. We're going to come back to him later. He is the author of a smoking gun memo that we are going to see and come back to. In any event, let me get this clip started again, back up. Looks good. Yeah, a little room for a transcript here, and let's get it on.
Mr. Chairman, the financial markets are in quite fragile condition, and I think absent a plan they will certainly get worse. But even at their current state, they are not serving the necessary function to support the economy. Credit is not being provided. Secretary Paulson mentioned non-financial companies are not able to finance themselves overnight. Credit is just not going to be available. It's going to also affect savers because of the value of their assets that they have. So even in the current condition, even if things don't get severely worse, but I think they would get worse without some kind of action, this will be a major drag on the U.S. economy and will greatly impede the ability of the economy to recover in a healthy way.
Okay, so there's your hook. Non-financial companies can't get lending in the overnight commercial paper market. At least that's Ben Bernanke's story. Now, we happen to know already that Ben Bernanke is lying through his teeth right there. How? Well, there's two different ways. One, researchers at his own Federal Reserve wrote a paper saying that their boss was lying, that there was no problem whatsoever in the non-financial commercial paper market. Non-financial commercial paper, that means Main Street. And that was the story, that Main Street businesses couldn't get lending in the overnight commercial paper market, and they weren't going to be able to make payroll. The Federal Reserve came out with a paper in mid-October of 2008, and they said, no problem in the non-financial commercial paper market at all. The second and real way we know that Ben Bernanke is lying is that as he is giving this testimony, and remember, he's giving this testimony in September 23rd, I believe, of 2008. As he is giving this testimony, he is secretly working on his own commercial paper bailout program called the Commercial Paper Funding Facility, but he is not disclosing it to Congress. He is concealing it from Congress. And the reason he's concealing it from Congress is that it was an $800 billion program in which the Federal Reserve was giving money to financial institutions in the U.S., including Citigroup, Bank of America, and AIG, not to mention a bunch of non-financial or non-banking financial companies. And he was giving money in the commercial paper program from the Federal Reserve. A lot of money went to foreign banks like UBS, RBS, Dexia, banks you've never heard of over in Europe. There was not a single penny in Ben Bernanke's secret bailout program of commercial paper that went to Main Street. So when he is in Congress telling us, oh, well, we need to bail out non-financial companies, that's the real problem here, that's why we need the bailout, he's simply lying through his teeth. Now, you might ask yourself whether someone like Ben Bernanke is uncomfortable when he's just lying his face off to Congress. And that's why I'm going to look at the next clip. In the next clip, we're going to show Senator Charles Schumer. And Schumer is a big bailout proponent. He wants to help his Wall Street buddies. And so what Schumer's going to do is he's going to recount the very story that Ben Bernanke told to Congress on September 18th. Schumer's got a problem, though, that he's not aware of. One is that Ben Bernanke is very uncomfortable during this next clip. His body language tells you everything you need to know about the lie he was just telling. And B, Schumer doesn't know that the C-SPAN cameraman is going to watch Ben Bernanke. The camera's going to stay on Ben Bernanke and not on Charles Schumer. Watch this. This is simply incredible. Schumer. Yeah, we don't need a transcript for this one.
There are real dangers if we do not act. The description Chairman Bernanke gave us when the leadership of the Democratic and Republican House and Senate met in the Speaker Pelosi's conference room, the description Chairman Bernanke gave in quiet terms, without hyperbole, was astounding. Chairman Bernanke told us that our American economy's arteries, our financial system, is clogged, and if we don't act, the patient will surely suffer a heart attack. Maybe next week, maybe in 6 months, but it will happen. So we must act, and we must act soon. And make no mistake about it, while Wall Street caused the problems we face, unfortunately, if we do nothing, Main Street will also pay a severe price.
Well, okay. You think Ben might have looked a little nervous there during his testimony? Actually, we know he was nervous because we know he was lying, as I pointed out earlier. But what about Mr. Spooky there, Scott Alvarez? Why did he look so tense during Ben's testimony about commercial paper problems on Main Street? Well, I'll tell you why. Scott Alvarez, a week before you saw this testimony, on September 15, 2008, Scott Alvarez had written a memo in which he reveals that the plan all along among the Treasury and the Federal Reserve was never about commercial paper. It was never about Main Street. The plan the entire time was about direct injections of cash to Wall Street banks. And Scott Alvarez had written this memo himself during a teleconference with AIG And that was the plan all along. So everything you just saw, all the testimony you just saw from Ben Bernanke about commercial paper problems on Main Street, that was a total and complete lie. And Alvarez knew it was a lie as Ben Bernanke was testifying. And that is why Scott Alvarez looked so tense. He should have been tense because he knew that Ben Bernanke was up there before Congress perjuring himself. By the way, hat tip to Eves for the Scott Alvarez memo, the smoking gun memo that we're going to look at right now. She dug this out of the AIG trial in 2014. I believe it was day one of the testimony. But in any event, I want to get into this memo. So let's just do that. Let me punch this up. There is the memo, and let's just get into it, starting with the date. The date is September 15th, 2008, 10:15 p.m. So this is the night of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. The purpose of the conference call is to talk about AIG, which is now at risk itself of going bankrupt because Lehman just did. There's a list of names here on the left. So Tim Geithner, Don Cohn, Neil Kashkari are from, Kevin Warsh, I think, too. They're all from the Fed. Dan Jesser is from Treasury. He's a longtime colleague of Hank Paulson from Goldman Sachs, by the way. So Treasury and Fed are both on the call. You can see Alvarez puts the problem right here. Unlike Lehman, the failure of AIG might cause failure at other institutions. So what's the solution to this? Alvarez puts this on page 2. You can see powers we would want. Then, after the wizards from Treasury and the Fed chant the word systemic 3 times, here you have it. Buy any stock, preferred or common. So buy stock, a direct cash injection, in other words, in systemic banks like Goldman and Citigroup. Okay, so there you've seen the smoking gun memo. Now you know why these guys were so nervous, because the plan from day one was to inject cash directly into Wall Street banks. It was never had anything to do with commercial paper. It never had anything to do with Main Street. The plan all along was just cash to Wall Street. That is why Scott Alvarez and Ben Bernanke are both nervous while he is delivering this huge pile of lies to Congress's face. And as you saw from the memo and from the list of people in that memo, that was both a Treasury and a Federal Reserve undertaking. So they were all in on it together. They were all in on the lies, including Hank Paulson, which brings us to the second massive lie that these guys told Congress. This one comes courtesy, obviously, of Hank Paulson, who gave us a toxic mortgage lie. He said, well, if we don't buy toxic mortgages, we're going to have Armageddon. So let's just get right into that. Let me bring this clip up. This is Representative Jordan, I believe, of Ohio. Let's get right into it. Here we go.
I want to go back to October 3rd, because that's when this whole thing started. When we started down this bailout road, this bailout fever that's grabbed Washington, it frankly started on October 3rd when the Congress of the United States decided to give you $700 billion of taxpayer money. And the whole premise of that action was that you were going to take that money and you were going to go buy the troubled and toxic assets. You were going to clean things up and things were going to get back on the right track. And yet, to date, the Treasury has not purchased those assets. So I want to know, when did you know that you could not be able to do what you told Congress? I remember sitting in on the conference calls with you and Mr. Bernanke. I remember when you came in front of lawmakers and you talked about, we're going to buy these troubled assets. And yet, actually 10 days later, you had changed direction completely and instead just injected capital into the institution. So did you deceive Congress before the October 3rd vote, Mr. Paulson?
Okay, obviously we, the viewer, know the answer to that question. Yes, Hank Paulson did lie. We know that from the smoking gun memo, in which we found out that the plan all along was to inject cash into Wall Street. And yet here is Hank Paulson 8 days later testifying that, oh, it's toxic assets. We had to buy the toxic assets. This is just incredible. In fact, if you think about it, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, that was the legislation that eventually passed. The whole thing is a lie in view of that smoking gun memo, which was dated September 15th. The Troubled Asset Relief Program didn't pass until October 3rd. The entire legislation is premised on a lie. But you have to remember in this clip that Jordan doesn't know that. Jordan suspects that true, but he doesn't know it. And now Hank Paulson is going to get up there and ply his trade as a professional liar. So let's watch the professional liar, Hank Paulson, get out of this, because he knows that Jordan does not have the benefit of the smoking gun memo written by that other liar, Scott Alvarez. Let's just see how this plays out. Here we go. Watch the liar go.
We went to Congress And when we asked for authority to buy illiquid assets, we also recognized we needed flexibility. And we worked with Congress to make sure that we had the flexibility to deal with whatever we had coming at us. Congress, I believe, knew they were giving us this flexibility, and thank goodness they did give us that flexibility.
Okay, you see what's going on here? You see the out Hank Paulson has given himself? He's saying, yeah, I told you guys that we wanted to buy toxic mortgages, but I also asked for flexibility. We asked for flexibility and you guys gave it to us. So there's no problem here because under the umbrella of flexibility, it was okay for us to directly inject cash into the banks of our Wall Street buddies. So there's no problem at all, except that there is a problem because guess what? There's someone on the committee who's paying attention and who has a pretty good memory. And this is Representative Lynch of Massachusetts, who remembers exactly what Paulson said and sticks it in his face and forces Paulson to admit that he lied. Let's take a look at this clip. Let's bring it up. Yeah, a little room for a transcript as we watch Hank Paulson lie his face off.
By the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to go back to the line of questioning suggested by Mr. Jordan of Ohio. I also sit on the Financial Services Committee. You testified at least a half a dozen times before that committee prior to the TARP vote. You did indeed, in all of your testimony, along with Mr. Bernanke, express the intent, the central intent of this TARP program was to buy toxic assets to get the economy moving again and to get folks lending again. And you pounded away at that central theme. And what Mr. Jordan was saying, that a matter of days went by and you changed completely the focus of that program. Now, in my opinion, you misled Congress. When you were asked by Mr. Bacchus in the Financial Services Committee, he said, wouldn't it be more impactful, I'm paraphrasing, to just inject the money directly in the banks? And what was your response?
I believe I said right there that...
You said that wouldn't work. You dismissed that. You dismissed that in open committee.
Right.
Which led members of Congress to believe that you weren't going to do that.
Okay, do you see what went on there? By the way, props to Representatives Jordan and Lynch for that takedown. It was a nice takedown of a professional liar, a great 1-2 punch. But I want you to see what went on there. Hank Paulson tried to squirm out of the specifics of saying, oh no, I'm going to buy toxic assets. That's specifically what I'm going to do. By saying, generally, I asked for flexibility in front of Congress, and you guys gave it to me. Lynch comes back and then says, no, that's not going to work. You were specifically asked in committee whether you were going to hand cash, whether you were going to directly inject Wall Street banks with cash, and you said no, that would not be effective. And so now you are precluded from going back on that testimony and saying, oh, no, that's what I meant all along under the general heading of flexibility, when you specifically said you would not do that. By the way, this sets up a great case of perjury in view of the smoking gun memo, because you just saw Paulson admit in front of Lynch that, yes, I told you I would not inject cash to Wall Street. And yet we see from that memo that that was the plan from day one, from the day of September 15th when Lehman went down. That was the plan from the beginning, and it never changed. Throughout the bailout process, the plan of injecting Wall Street with cash never changed. So all these other stories they made up are just ridiculous. The commercial paper story is ridiculous. Paulson's toxic asset story is ridiculous. The troubled asset relief program itself, the title of the legislation, is a lie. And now we come to our third, and incredibly the most ridiculous story of them all, the money market mutual fund story. This one comes courtesy of Paul Kanjorski on a C-SPAN call-in show on January 27, 2009. And Kanjorski is relaying here what he heard from Paulson and Bernanke and the gang about what was happening on Thursday, September 18th. Listen to Kanjorski's rendition of these events. This is just amazing. Yeah, here we go. No need for a transcript here.
On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed.
Okay, let's cut that real quick. Kanjorski is making so many errors here, I need to stop before I lose track of them. First of all, the $5.5 trillion figure is absurd. The entire market in money market mutual funds back then was $3.4 trillion. A $5.5 trillion run was thus impossible. Second, it was not a $550 billion run in 1 to 2 hours. It was $165 billion in 3 weeks. Big difference there, Paul. Also, it was not a $105 billion pump job by the Treasury. It was merely a $50 billion guarantee by the Treasury. Fourth, the $250,000 guarantee did not come from the Treasury for money market mutual funds. That came from the FDIC and was for commercial bank accounts and checking accounts. Fifth, and relatedly, there was no bank run, Paul. It was a money market mutual fund and it was not a run. There is a big difference between a bank, a commercial bank, and a money market mutual fund. One can create money out of thin air, the commercial banks, and the other cannot. So get your terms straight. Finally, regardless of all these errors he makes, even if you accept every single thing Kanjorski says as true, we still have a major problem in that there was never any explanation for why all of those things justified TARP on October 3rd, 2008. You just heard Kanjorski say that the Treasury shut down that money market operation on September 18th, the very day of. So why 2 weeks later do we need the Treasury to step in with $700 billion? This whole story simply doesn't make any sense, but let's let Kanjorski go on and finish this absurd tale of woe for Wall Street.
Now, we talked at that time about what would happen if that happened. It would have been the end of our economic system and our political system as we know it. And that's why, when they made the point, we've got to act and do things quickly, we did. Now, Secretary Paulson said, let's buy out the subprime mortgages. That's what he came to Congress, but he said, give us latitude and large authority to do many things as we decide necessary, and give us $700 billion to do that.
Wow. Okay, that makes total sense. So you're having a $5.5 trillion problem in one market, the money market mutual funds, and so 2 weeks later, after the horse is already out of the barn, you're going to take a fraction of that money, $0.7 trillion, $700 billion, and you're going to spend it on mortgage-backed securities to retrieve the horse that's already been out of the barn for 2 weeks? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The whole story is ridiculous. Kanjorski butchers it. The whole thing was ridiculous from the beginning. All 3 TARP stories are totally ridiculous. They're all lies. Bernanke is a liar. Paulson's a liar. Alvarez is a liar. Kanjorski is probably just a senile old fool who can't keep his facts straight. But in any event, the whole thing was premised on a lie. TARP was, the bailouts were, and we to this day still do not know what really happened. Now, having said that, and having looked through the record, I have a pretty good idea of what was going on then. There was a long time, I went through a long period where I thought, well, these guys were just lying because they just wanted to pocket the money and give themselves bonuses, and that's certainly true. They did give themselves $70 billion of bonuses that year, and undoubtedly that factored in a little bit to the problem. But I do think that there was a genuine problem back then. I don't think Paulson and Bernanke were acting. I think the concern in their eyes was genuine. I think the fear in their eyes was genuine. I just think they were lying about what exactly the problem was. And like I say, I've got a pretty good idea of what the real problem was. And the reason they didn't want to tell you what the real problem was is that the solution to that problem would involve changes to Wall Street and changes in our monetary system that the powers that be are not ready to take on. The monetary system as configured now gives them, the powers that be, the criminals in charge of the banking system, incredible advantages over us, the serfs, we the people. And the powers that be are not willing to give that up yet. But I'll get into that in another tape. Like I say, I've got to lay some foundation. I'm going to cover a bit on the economy, and I'll come back to this. But for right now, we're out of time. That's all the time we have now. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you're doing well. I hope to see you again next time.